Hi, I'm Naomi Mercer, and we're going to talk about some of the best practices for web video production. First, let's talk about location. You want to shoot inside a building in a properly selected room. You don't want to shoot anything outside, whether it be on a porch, a balcony, a terrace, or at a park. And the reason for this is because usually it creates bad sound and not very good lighting. If possible, select a location with no mixed lighting sources. For example, light bleeding in from a window, fluorescent lights, or your own personal light sources. The reason for this is because they all blend together and your eyes can adjust to look at that light, but the camera cannot. Select a location with a minimal amount of ambient noise. For example, people talking, appliances that are on or plugged in, or any kind of outside noise that's bleeding into the room. When you're selecting your location, you might want to try just going into the room and standing there for 30 seconds and just listen for any excess noise that's bleeding in. Here's a good example of what not to do. I'm standing in front of a window right now, so the lighting should make me look sort of silhouetted. And in addition, there's sound leaking in from outside. There's a plane flying overhead and a leaf blower. Now, I'm just exaggerating to prove a point here, but these things do affect you very much later in the editing process. Select a location with enough room between the camera, the lights, and the presenter, so as not to have unwanted shadows, uneven lighting, or tight shots that cut off the action. Pay attention to the background behind the presenter. You want to select a flat color background and not something that has patterns or anything that's distracting to the viewer. If you had something like a bookshelf or a map in the background, first of all, it's very distracting to the viewer of the video, and second of all, it doesn't allow for good compression when you're later putting that video up on the web. There should be enough room so that the presenter is separated from the wall. So you don't want to have the subject right up against the wall. You want to have them about 2 feet at least away from the wall. This helps with shadows that cast on the wall as well. A totally empty room will produce bad sound. The sound will reverberate and bounce off of the walls and create sort of an echo. You want to shoot in a room that's filled with things like furniture and cloth curtains. So let's talk about camera setup and your composition. Always use a tripod. You want to keep the shot steady and don't overuse zoom or pan. Set up the camera with the proper white balance. In the menu settings, you'll find a daylight or outdoor setting and a tungsten or indoor setting. Since you're going to be shooting indoors, you'll want to select the tungsten or indoor setting. If you have a custom setting on the camera, have your presenter hold up a white sheet of paper, zoom in on that sheet of paper, and adjust the white balance. You want to white balance for every location. Here's 2 examples of how your video can look without the proper white balance. Like this, and like this. Frame the presenter using a slightly zoomed in lens. Try to avoid having it wide and zoomed out all the way, as this will create some visual distortion. This will create a more natural looking composition. You want to zoom all the way out on your lens and then zoom in just slightly, and then if you need to, physically move the camera forward or backward in relationship to your presenter. Put the camera at the same height as your presenter. If the presenter is standing, you want to have the camera be right at eye level with that presenter, not above and not below. Think of it as if you were a person talking to that presenter. If they were standing up, you would be standing up too. And if they were sitting down, you would naturally adjust and sit down along with them. Frame up the shot with just enough headroom. About 2 inches is good enough above their head. You also don't want to leave so much headroom that it feels like the presenter is sinking out of the composition. Frame up the shot so that there's enough room for the presenter's hands, especially if they're doing something where they're using their hands while they're talking. You don't want to have them reach their hand out and have it cut off from the frame. Avoid strong vertical lines from behind the presenter, such as the edges of a painting or picture, or a plant that's sticking out from behind the subject's head. Focus. With the latest generation of cameras, autofocus works great, so just stay on autofocus. Exposure. Just like with focus, you can leave it on the auto exposure setting. Okay, let's talk about wardrobe. It's best to wear a single colored shirt, dress, or jacket. You want to avoid any colors that are going to freak out the camera, like white, black, red, or any really bright colors or patterns. It's similar to a background where if it's a very big pattern, it's going to be distracting, and it's also going to be hard to compress later in editing. Shoot pre-roll and post-roll, allowing for an extra 5 seconds on the beginning and end of each take. This will help a lot with editing later. Now let's talk about lighting. Place the presenter away from daylight leaking in from any windows, whether it's a window to the side that's out of the shot or a window behind the presenter. That's going to make the presenter too dark and the light leaking in from the window too bright. You also want to avoid having any shiny or reflective objects in the frame, as this could also adjust the exposure and make the presenter look too dark. Try to avoid any daylight leaking in through windows and turn off any overhead fluorescence so that you're only dealing with a controlled light source. If you mix these lighting sources, they all have a different color when recording to video. The human eye can adjust, but the video camera cannot. Here's a good example of what not to do. I have 2 things wrong with this shot. 1, a busy map behind me for my background, and 2, I have multiple lighting sources. To my right, I have a window letting in daylight, and on my left, I have a tungsten. No good. Use the lighting as best you can, or adjust what you're filming when you can't, meaning the person in the middle of the composition or the frame should be bright with some shadows in the background, but you don't want there to be too many dark areas. And remember, you can always move the presenter around. If no controlled lighting sources are available, then find an evenly lit, bright indoor area, such as opposite a window with diffused lighting coming in, though not direct sunlight. Be aware, though, that if you are using lighting from an outside source, it can change throughout the day. If you're going to use such a scenario, don't shoot for longer than 2 hours, otherwise that will create a nightmare in editing later. You want your light to be lighting up the front of the subject and just off to the side. Think about what the sun does when it's not midday. You also want to make sure to not have light coming directly down on the subject, as this creates some nasty, very unflattering shadows. Try using the basic 3-point lighting system for good video. Do a web search for 3-point lighting system and lots of diagrams and tips will come up to help you. Your key light is your strongest light, while your fill light is the light that fills in the shadows around. If you're using identical lights, you want to have the key light closer to the subject and the fill light a little further back. Think of a clock face when placing your lights. So for example, if the camera is at 6 and the presenter is at 12, then your key light should be at 4 and your fill light at 8. The key light is the main, stronger light for the subject, while the fill light is a little further back and fills in all of the shadows. Remember to be aware of the distance between the background, presenter, camera, and lights. Remember, it's all about balance. If you have the lights too close to the subject, it will show up as too bright and the background too dark. So now we're going to talk about sound. For clean sound, use a clip-on or lapel microphone, like this one right here, or an external shotgun microphone close to the person you're filming. Don't ever use the built-in microphone in the camera. There are 3 things wrong with this shot. 1, I've got a busy pattern map background. Terrible. 2, I've got multiple lighting sources. I have light bleeding in from this window and I'm using a tungsten light on my left. And lastly, I'm using the built-in microphone on the camcorder rather than a clip-on mic. Terrible. It's best to set up sound levels manually. Automatic sound levels can be erratic and you can hear things when the person isn't speaking. You want to do a sound check and have the person be naturally speaking while you're checking the sound levels. Usually people speak louder when they're saying testing 1, 2, 3, and then they drop the volume into their natural voice when they're recording. Tell your subject to speak naturally and then set the volume control as high as possible without going into the red zone. Always wear headphones so that you can monitor what's being recorded. You can hear what's actually being recorded into the camcorder and make sure that you don't have a dead battery on your microphone, that it's not accidentally unplugged, or that you don't have any interference. If your subject starts to speak much louder than before and it goes into the red zone, you're going to have distorted sound. It's okay to stop the recording, set the levels a little lower, and go again, because once you have distorted sound, you can't fix it. If your sound is quiet, you can always raise the volume, but once your sound is distorted, you can't fix that later in editing. So now we'll cover shooting for editing. It's usually best to film a scene using multiple shots, giving different perspectives to what's being viewed, but don't overdo it. Use a wide shot, also known as the master shot, to show the room and the presenter, a medium shot to move in closer on the action, and a close-up shot to emphasize the product or show what the hands are doing. If the recording has to be stopped due to a mistake, or if you need to take a break for some reason, change the shot by zooming in or out so that when the presenter continues, you can seamlessly put those two together in editing later. Next, we're going to talk about editing. Editing means putting together just the shots that you need, so you want to remove anything that's boring or unnecessary. Preview your raw footage to familiarize yourself with what you've shot. Log your takes as you watch and mark the ones that you want to use. Edit with a good mix of wide, medium, and close-up shots. It will make it look more interesting. You can also do a web search on video editing tips to make your editing look more professional. So now we're going to talk about compression for the web. Bad source material, like bad lighting, a shaky camera, or a busy pattern on the background or presenter, makes for bad compression. Again, for best practices, you can do a web search for video compression tips. So now we're going to talk about your checklist. To wrap it up, here's a quick checklist for shooting. Choose an appropriate location for space, lighting, and sound. Allow the presenter to collect and gather their thoughts before they begin. Also, check battery power. Always use the AC adapter when possible. Make sure you do a white balance. Do a sound check. Check the levels and check the headphones. Do a lighting check and do a tape check if you're using a tape. Date and timestamp off. You don't want to record the date and time into your image. Image stabilization on, if the camera has that setting. Tripod lockdown, and shoot! And good luck!